Hello again, Steve here with a few thoughts for the day, or for the night shall I say. It's about my bedtime, so I won't make this very long. Try to give a few thoughts that came to mind today. Not sure where they came from or what it was in reference to, but I was thinking today about how, we all know that we're led astray by many well-intended people, and indeed well-intended people. But there's the old saying, the path to hell is paved with good intentions, and we end up in these struggles, right? We're confused and we don't seem to be able to make headway that we want to make, and so on. And we realize at certain points in our lives that we're full up with a bunch of nonsense, right? And what I have noticed lately, more and more so lately, as I become more aware perhaps of certain segments of my consciousness, is that what we've been told a lot of times by our teachers, our familial groups, our schools, our religions, and what have you, we've been told conclusions, other people's conclusions, as being correct for us. Fair bit of that, and probably not enough of how to actually form our own conclusions. So this is a project for me to work on, and maybe it works for you too as well, I don't know. But my question is, how about we work on systems, or a system of forming conclusions? In other words, strengthen our ability to work through our thought process. There's probably various ways that could work for us, but I think we talked about this before in other topics, but one was the trivium, right? But the one that works really clearly for me is the imagery of a computer, where you have input, process, and output. You don't just feed. If you want to do a Google search, you don't just type in what you found already. No, you type something in so that the machine and its connection to the system can process what you've put in, and now out comes what you're looking for. Well, we can do that too, of course, right? Because the whole of our life is an experience of inputs. I mean, we're getting messages from people all the time, and messages from the environment, and from what we read and what we watch, and talking heads like me. It's ongoing, and even our own thoughts and our own signals coming from our body and our emotions, all that sort of thing. It's constantly coming into our consciousness if we want to be aware of it. And if we have a way of processing that, systematically processing it, we can come to a conclusion. Whereas, I was just listening to a talk by somebody about how there are people who will say that they think with their heart. In other words, they rely mostly on their emotions up front, which, because emotions are a little bit more random than decided thoughts. They show up as the consequence of actions, as we talked about before with mood following actions. So if we're following what we're experiencing, then we're rather random, right? We're very random. Whereas if we rely a lot on the part of us that we have a control over based on decisions. In other words, what are we going to think about? How are we going to put these things together in our minds? How are we going to connect? How are we going to hear? Are we going to listen to this? Are we going to read this? Are we going to go out to this talk tonight? Are we going to stay the extra hour we were asked for at work? These are all decisions we can make which take place in what we call our mind, right? And therefore, that's the part of us which, more than anything else, is like the governor that we have control over. And I think, see, here we go again, I'm making that decision. But honestly, I think that when we spend more time, it's not that, emotions are not important, very important in terms of the experience of our lives, but they're more like input that's telling us something. But the processor unit, notice that a processor unit on a computer is sometimes called a logic center, right? It analyzes and it makes decisions based on its input. And it's not whimsical. It's very consistent. The more consistent we can be. And I think that the way we be consistent with our thoughts is we have a base of principles. We have what it is that we stand for, what is right and what is wrong for us. Is it right or is it wrong to tell lies arbitrarily to people? Is it right or is it wrong to steal from people? Is it right or is it wrong to damage our bodies in some ways by eating foul food or abusing ourselves and this sort of thing? We have these foundations. I mean, despite whether I would agree or not agree with many religious ways of morality, what is valuable about it, I think, though, is that the people within certain religions will have a base of principles, and if they live by them, then at least they have a standard to go by. Now, they're not necessarily derived by any sort of rational process. In other words, they themselves are other people's conclusions, so therefore I wouldn't agree with them in a way. However, even if something is somebody's conclusion, if it can be worked through and it holds up to reason and evidence, then it is the basis for some sort of a principle to hold in place, or a conclusion to maintain, or a conclusion to stand, right? I just wanted to share that this evening because I thought it was really important. It was a couple things came together and I wanted to talk about it. I'd written on my notebook here. Truth, in other words, in brackets, other people's conclusions, rather than how we think. So we've been taught a lot of conclusions, and we haven't been encouraged to analyze those conclusions. We're told things like, there is God, and this is our God's name, and our God is the true God, for example. We haven't been told to now examine that in your own life and see if it works for you. See if that conclusion that I stand by is a conclusion for you. We're not that was never encouraged for me, as an example. Or you were born here and therefore you are a Canadian. Well, if I'm saying that, say as an instructor of a small child or whatever, I'm not going to tell the child that is my conclusion, or that is what I have accepted as valid. Now, is that valid for you? Because as the small kid, they might ask, well, how about that kid living on the other side of the world? And they're not? No, they're not, says the teacher. Yeah, but they're not much different than me, are they? They still have blood running in their veins and a heart and they eat food and all that. You see, this is part of the processing. The processing with the processor that we have, with this mental faculty that we have. Surely if we have it, then that's what it's for, right? It'd be like buying this really expensive computer that was a really good processor, but not using it as a processor, using it as a workbench or something like that. And then just making up our own conclusions, or doing longhand mathematics or longhand calculations when, like imagine back in the day when there was big calculators, right? If we use the back of the calculator as we'd have a piece of chalk and we're writing out as a what they used to call that a slate. We're using it as a slate to do our calculations, and we're coming to these very, well, even that as a process, of course. Or we're guessing. We're just writing an answer there. There's my conclusion. And it's my conclusion because I say it is. Well, how is it arrived at? And one of the places, though, that's interesting where we did learn about this, but it wasn't transferred into other areas of our lives as well, is in mathematics. Because I remember in mathematics when I was in school years ago, even in grade 9, 10 maybe, very often there was a part of the, when you did an examination, part of the score was given for the process that you showed how it is that you arrived at the conclusion. Because of course there was always cheaters, right? There'd be the guy who always wants to sit close to the smartest one. You could peek over and write the answer down. So if you wrote the answer down, well, in some classes he'd get 0 because he showed no process. Because, you know, the process is, it shows that you know how to arrive at the conclusion. Even there, though, as I can recall, there were very few people that I remember in math class who actually knew anything about math. They would memorize a formula. They would memorize they basically memorize a formula of how things went across. And they didn't really understand the logic behind it. I found that when I understood the logic behind it, I didn't need a formula. I could just work it through based on the logic of it, based on understanding the logic. And this becomes a natural thing even in, I mean, it's a challenge, of course, for sure. But one of the things that probably really helps, I know it's helped me a lot, is in our guarding, if you will, guarding against the conclusions that people will throw out, rhetoric that people will throw out, and, you know, don't expect any challenge or it's supposed to stand, is by questioning. You know, because if somebody throws out a conclusion, you know, I remember that in math, where the teacher would say sometimes, even if you got the right answer, it's, if you haven't shown a process, it's really wrong because I don't understand. I don't understand how you got there. So one of the things that we can do, I think, that helps is when we get into situations where people throw rhetoric, throw conclusions and then continue on as though we were already up to speed, is to say, well, hang on a second, I don't understand. I don't understand how you got there. Can you explain what you mean by, you know, all Canadian citizens must, or, you know, public school is a great idea, or something like that. I don't understand that. Because I don't understand how you arrived at it. I mean, to me, it doesn't. To me, it's because I've arrived at a conclusion which says that it's not. But if you say it is, and even if you arrived at the same conclusion, I might still be interested in how you got there. Because in understanding how people got there, we can understand our compatibility. If there's no substance to how they got there, then all they're doing is usually just parroting other people's conclusions once again, and these conclusions get passed and passed and passed and passed. So it becomes the public discourse. But it's not individual rationality whatsoever. I know it's a bit of ramble, but, you know, it's what I love to do, so I'm glad some people are interested in it as well. Just a few words on the difference, I guess, between other people's truths, or they're basically conclusions, which they would hope that we accept without any sort of debate, versus actually learning how to work through something to arrive at our own conclusions, or even to arrive at our own ignorance, is important, because at least we've exhausted an effort, or we've worked through an effort of a process, just like the computer does. And sometimes the computer, you know, when you try to process something, you get an error that comes up, or search not found. but it's tried, right? It's worked its process. And in discussion with other people, sometimes we can figure out really quickly whether people are blowing smoke or they're honest, because if people will, when asked, how is it you arrive at that conclusion, if they just go off on sophistry, or insults or logical fallacies, then maybe they're really not interested in examining that or feel put in a corner or whatever. But if they're honest, they'll say, well, gee, that's a good question. I never really thought of that. I thought that was common knowledge, but yeah, you're right. I don't really have any foundation to that. What do you think? How did you arrive at how you arrived? And so we see the character of people to be willing to learn and grow with us. And if relationships are important, it's a way of gauging people in a way and to see where they are. It doesn't mean that people are bad people if they're not like that. But it just tells us where they are. Like, we're always gaining information, right? We're always gaining information that we can process that information and get a clearer picture of our world in a way, right? Of all our surroundings and our growth. So it all helps us with our own self-knowledge too. It all helps with our skill of living. The skill of living, of being able to be great detectors of what is false and what is more truthful, and what is more healthy for us and what isn't, and what relationships are worth pursuing or not, for example. No conclusions here today, just a few rambling thoughts about sort of the difference between people's truths and conclusions versus being able to think through for ourselves. And it's not as though we're not going to gain everything ourselves, right? We're not going to work through everything from raw data up ourselves. We're always learning from other people. It's the greatest source of information in a way. But we got to be able to process it in some way. And if we have a rigor in a way, it's sort of like a rigor again, especially in terms of our values in life, of what's good for us, what's wholesome for us, what's good for our path that we're on, and what's going to be helpful for us in our relationships, in our career and all this sort of thing. If we can gauge things as to whether they're helpful or they're not, and we have a process of seeing the information, processing, being able to quickly jettison what isn't in accordance with what we want, and gather up what we need, and put it together, and we form a conclusion. A conclusion, of course, for us is going to be unique because it's unique for our situation. It's going to be something like, yes or no, this is helpful for me in this sort of category. Whether it's vitally important or not. It might just be triviality. It might be an example. It might be a metaphor. It might be a, allegory. Just something that's inspirational or whatever. But it's not a technical item that we need for our project. It's just something that lifts us up a little bit. There's all these different gaugings that we go on, and life is like that. It's so bountiful, and it's so bountiful. We're like this huge giant sieve, aren't we? Which we can open and close the gates to that sieve and catch what is helpful, process it, digest it, use it, let it go, capture it all and be overwhelmed and bounced around, and everything in between. And that's what's so wonderful about life, is this ability to learn in a way, right? One of the things that's wonderful about it. But I think it's important to be able to draw conclusions for ourselves that are helpful for ourselves, and that's all I wanted to share tonight. I said I was going to give it a few minutes, and here I am, almost at 20 minutes. All this stuff. Anyways, Steve here again. I'll sign off for now. It's great talking. We'll talk again soon. Bye-bye for now.